Welcome to the third lesson of this first module of the Technical SEO course. In this lesson, we're going to cover what hosting is, the difference between hosted and self-hosted, what a good host should do, shared versus dedicated hosting, and we're also going to touch on CDNs. First up, what actually is hosting? There's two different types of hosts that we need to know about. The first one is web hosts, and this is where content is stored, so where a website is hosted on a server. The second one is domain hosts, and this is where details are stored on domain names, and this host is going to typically be where you bought the domain from. These hosts will use a domain name system, or DNS, to connect that domain with a website, email, and other services. So what is web hosting? For content to be published on the internet, you'll first need a website on which to publish it. And this website has to be hosted somewhere. When a user requests a URL that is on your website, it talks to the server that the website is hosted on, which then should fulfill that request. The longer version of this is you enter a URL into your web browser. The browser is then going to look up the IP address for that domain name via DNS. The browser then sends a HTTP request to the server that it got through that DNS. Then that server is then going to send back a HTTP response, and then the browser can then begin downloading and rendering the HTML that it's given. You can either host that website yourself, or you can utilize a hosting company to do this for you. So just touching on hosted versus self-hosted. A hosted site is typically built with a website builder, such as Wix, Shopify, Squarespace, and WordPress.com. And a self-hosted website is typically more customizable, but as Uncle Ben from Spider-Man would say, with great power comes great responsibility. With self-hosted, you have to control literally everything. You have to run the backups and update everything and make sure of a lot of different factors with your website. So you're basically in control of literally everything you can think of. With hosted, so a hosted option, a lot of that pain is taken away. But on the other side of that, you're going to have a lot less control over a lot of the finer details. For most small to medium sized businesses, hosted solutions generally do work best, but it's always best to fully understand your business's needs and the differences between hosted and self-hosted. So touching on shared versus dedicated hostings, if you've decided on a hosted solution, and I suppose to a degree self-hosted, you should be given an option to decide whether to have shared or dedicated hosting. And using a shared server is kind of like living in a block of flats without really knowing who your neighbors are. It is, however, generally much cheaper, and it's a really good choice for those website owners who don't necessarily have that much technical skills to be able to manage and control everything. With shared hosting, you're going to have kind of limited admin access, and you're not going to be able to fully customize everything. You should have access to something like a cPanel to be able to allow you to edit the basic stuff, but there's not going to be as detailed options as you'd get with a dedicated host. So using a dedicated server is like owning your own detached house. It's typically more expensive, but you should be able to, sustain larger amounts of traffic far more easily. And there's far more control available within a dedicated server. It's a great choice for those who, have a decent technical background and can, manage and configure that server on their own. However, there are numerous hosts out there who will be able to give you dedicated server space without you having to have that much technical know-how. So a good host, if you decide to use a hosted solution, a good host should provide excellent support, provide that option to have the dedicated or shared server, be able to scale to demand, and this is incredibly important, especially with small to medium-sized businesses that might not necessarily be receiving that much online traffic. When you start implementing SEO recommendations, you start growing your site, that host is going to need to be able to scale to the demand that you need. needs to be security focused. This is something that is quite big. We've got an entire module focused to security later on, but that host should have security at the forefront of their offering. Should also be able to provide detailed information on uptime, and they should also offer functionality such as the ability to sort of whitelist or blacklist IP addresses. Incredibly useful if you need to, crawl your website, or you want to block certain bots from accessing your website, or prevent scrapers and that sort of thing. Before we finish up this lesson, it's definitely worth touching on CDNs and what they are and what they're used for. While not strictly necessary or required for hosting a website, they're immensely useful, and it's definitely good information to have. So a CDN is a group of servers that are globally distributed to allow for faster delivery of content worldwide. And a CDN can be used as an addition to a web hosting service, allowing you to cache your content on their servers. This can allow for greater performance and security. In addition, it can reduce that reliance, the overall reliance on the single server, and allow for far greater uptime potential. An example of a very well-regarded CDN is Cloudflare. In this lesson, we've looked at what hosting is, hosted versus self-hosted, differences between the two, what a good host should do, shared versus dedicated hosting, and we've just finished by looking at CDNs.